Emily was driving down a deserted, snow-covered road near Seattle when something caught her eye. A vague shape among the trees. Her heart pounded as she realized what it was. A Malamute tied to a snow-laden tree, barely moving. Who could be so heartless? She slammed on the brakes, leapt out of the car, and raced toward the dog. But when she tried to free it, she found the rope frozen solid, cutting into the animal's skin. The dog was frail, its eyes lifeless. She had to act fast, and what she did next was staggering. Everything shifted in that instant. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening from the cold despite the heater blasting at full force. Icy winds seeped through the car's cracks, making her shiver. The dashboard thermometer read 5 degrees Celsius. The road stretched endlessly ahead, framed by snowdrifts and trees bowing under the storm's weight. Emily exhaled, desperate to reach home before the weather worsened. Then, something to her right, beyond the tree line, grabbed her attention. A dark figure stood out starkly against the snow. Her heart skipped a beat. She slowed down, her breath fogging the windshield. When the headlights illuminated it, her stomach twisted. It wasn't a shadow, it was a dog. A Malamute, tethered to a tree, nearly motionless, its fur caked with snow. Emily's pulse surged. She screeched to a halt, jumped out, and the freezing wind hit her like a blade. But she didn't care. She ran to the dog, her boots crunching on the icy ground, every second critical. The closer she got, the more horror gripped her. The dog lay still, its fur stiff with ice, ribs protruding beneath matted hair. The rope around its neck was taut and frozen, like a noose. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. She dropped to her knees beside it. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" she whispered. The dog didn't stir. With trembling hands, she touched its side. Faint, almost imperceptible movement, a shallow breath. It was alive. Emily exhaled sharply. Her hands shook. She had to get it out of there. She grabbed the rope and yanked hard, but it wouldn't budge. The ice held it fast. It was as if someone had left the dog there to die on purpose. Anger flared in Emily's chest. "Hang on, buddy," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. She stripped off her gloves and her fingers burned instantly as they met the icy rope. She tugged at the knot, but it was solid, fused to the tree's bark. Panic rose and the dog twitched faintly. A soft whimper escaped its cracked lips, its eyes cracking open, but there was no spark in them. Emily swallowed a lump in her throat. She couldn't let it die. She scanned the area frantically, searching for anything to cut the rope. Then the dog did something unexpected. With its last ounce of strength, it lifted its head a few inches and looked at her. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw a faint glimmer of hope. Emily had no idea what lay ahead. The cold stung her bare fingers as she clawed at the frozen rope. It wouldn't give, like an icy chain. The Malamute lay motionless, its breathing shallow and weak, its fur hardened by frost. Emily gritted her teeth. There was no time to hesitate. "Stay with me, buddy," she murmured, her voice trembling from cold and fear. How long had it been out here? Her fingers ached from the icy rope, but she kept pulling at the knot embedded in the ice. She needed something sharp. She looked around. Only snow-covered branches and chunks of ice, nothing useful. Then her eyes landed on her car keys. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She pulled them from her pocket and pressed the metal against the knot, scraping at the ice. Finally, a crack. The ice splintered just enough for her to tug harder, but the rope still held. Tears burned behind her eyes. Come on," she whispered in desperation. Emily wouldn't give up. She pulled with all her might, pouring every bit of energy into it. Her palms burned, her arms shook, then a sudden snap. The knot gave way, the rope unraveled and fell from the dog's neck like broken shackles. Emily barely had time to react before the Malamute collapsed into the snow. Her heart stopped. The dog didn't move, its body limp, its breathing nearly gone. No, she gasped. Her breath ragged, she tore off her coat and wrapped it around the dog's fragile frame. Its fur was ice cold, life clinging by a thread. Emily pressed her hand to its chest. Faint movement, it was still breathing, but just barely. Her mind raced. She'd freed it, but that wasn't enough. If she didn't warm it now, it wouldn't make it. Without a second thought, she scooped the dog into her arms and lifted it. It was terrifyingly light for its size. The dog let out a feeble whimper as she held it close, trying to share her warmth. "I've got you," she whispered. "I won't let go." The icy wind sliced her skin as she staggered to the car, unsure if it was already too late. But one thing she knew, she wouldn't leave it behind. Emily barely felt the cold biting into her as she trudged to the car, clutching the Malamute tightly against her chest. It was too still, like a bag of bones wrapped in frozen fur. Its breathing was so faint she could hardly sense it. "Stay with me, buddy," she whispered, her voice quaking as she opened the door and gently placed it on the passenger seat. Cold air rushed into the car, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it shuddered one last time before going still. Her breath caught. "No, no!" With trembling hands, she pressed her palm to its chest. A pause, then the slightest rise. It was alive but slipping away. Emily leapt into the driver's seat, cranked the heat to full blast, and gripped the wheel with numb fingers. She floored the gas, tires squealing on the ice as the car lurched forward. Her heart hammered. The nearest vet clinic was 25 minutes away. She didn't have 25 minutes. She glanced at the dog, eyes half open, unfocused, breathing almost undetectable. She had to do something. Her mind raced. She needed to warm it. She reached over, tucked the coat tighter around it, adjusted the vents to blow hot air its way. But it wasn't enough. It stayed too cold. Her shaking hands pressed against its side. The pulse was barely there. Terror squeezed her chest. It was fading. Then a desperate idea hit her. She yanked off her gloves and pressed her bare hands to the dog's frozen ribs. The cold made her gasp, but she didn't pull back. Leaning slightly, she kept one hand on the wheel and the other on its chest. "Come on, buddy, stay with me," she whispered. The car sped down the dark road, headlights barely cutting through the icy fog. Minutes passed. It didn't move. Emily bit her lip until it bled, then a faint, raspy sound. Her eyes snapped wide. She looked down. The dog's nose twitched, a weak whimper escaping its throat. Emily's breath hitched in relief, her heart pounding. She pressed her palm to its side again, still frigid, but it was fighting. She pushed the gas harder, the engine roaring, defying speed. She didn't care about breaking every traffic rule. She wouldn't let it die. Emily's car screeched to a stop outside the Pacific Paws Vet Clinic. The tires skidded on the icy pavement. The glowing emergency sign cast a cold light over the entrance. Barely parked, she flung the door open and rushed to the passenger side. The dog wasn't moving, her stomach dropped. "Hey, I need help!" she shouted, her voice cracking as she scooped it up and clutched it to her chest. The cold bit her exposed skin, her legs numb, but she didn't stop. The clinic doors burst open, and a woman in a uniform and thick jacket ran out. "Bring it inside, quick," she ordered, her eyes widening at the sight of the frail dog. Emily stumbled in, warm air enveloping her instantly. Only then did she realize how frozen she was, but she wasn't the one in danger. An assistant led her to a treatment table where supplies were already being prepped. Emily gently laid the Malamute down. It didn't react. A machine beeped as the vet pressed a stethoscope to its chest. The woman's face tightened. "Breathing shallow, too slow, body rigid from the cold," she said. Emily clenched her fists. "It was tied to a tree. I found it frozen out there. The rope so tight I thought." She shook her head. "I don't know how long it was there, but it barely made it." The assistant nodded grimly. "We'll do everything we can." A sharp voice cut in. "Get Dr. Harris." Emily tensed as a tall man in a white coat rushed in, his gray hair disheveled. Head vet, Dr. James Harris. "What's his temperature?" he barked. A nurse checked the screen and winced. "Too low to read," she replied. Emily's heart sank. Dr. Harris stayed calm, but his voice was firm. "Warm it up now. IV fluids, heat pads, oxygen, go." Emily stepped back, her pulse racing as the team sprang into action. She watched them wrap the dog's fragile body in warm blankets, insert a catheter, and place an oxygen mask over its muzzle. Her fists tightened. It had to make it. Time dragged like an eternity. Dr. Harris checked the dog's heart, eyes narrowed. Pulse weak, but stable for now. Emily swallowed hard. "Will it live?" Harris exhaled. "Too soon to tell." Her chest ached, but he added, "It's still fighting." That was enough. Emily rested a hand on the table's edge and whispered, "You're not alone." The dog didn't respond, but its ears twitched faintly for the first time. Emily sat in the dimly lit waiting room, hands clasped so tight her knuckles whitened. The clock's ticking echoed in her ears, each second stretching unbearably. She'd done all she could. Now it was up to the dog. The Malamute lay beyond the doors, swaddled in blankets, an IV pumping warm fluids into its weakened body. She hadn't noticed her coat and gloves were soaked with snow or that her fingers burned from the cold. All that mattered was whether it would pull through. The door creaked and Emily shot up. Dr. Harris stepped out, his coat rumpled, expression unreadable. "Is it still alive?" she asked. Her knees nearly buckled with relief as he said, "It's very weak, but its vitals are stabilizing slightly. Temperature's rising. A good sign." Emily let out a shaky breath. "Can I see it?" Harris hesitated, then nodded. "It's still unconscious, but I think it could use someone nearby." Emily didn't waste a second, following him to the treatment room. Her heart raced. The dog lay still on the padded table, tightly wrapped, a small oxygen mask over its muzzle. Monitors beeping softly. She swallowed. It looked so fragile. She approached slowly and stood beside it. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, barely audible. The dog didn't move, a knot forming in her throat. Had she been too late? Then a flicker. Its ears twitched and its eyelids fluttered slightly. Emily froze, breath held. Her fingers curled around the blanket. "That's it. You're okay," she whispered. Its breathing was faint, but it was fighting. Harris stepped forward, his voice softer. "It needs time. Its body's in shock and severely malnourished. We'll test for internal damage, but for now the key is it's alive." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She looked at the dog. Someone had done this, left it to die in the freezing cold, bound and helpless. Her fingers brushed its tangled fur. "I'll find out who," she thought furiously. Then Harris spoke. "We checked for a microchip." Emily's head snapped up. "Does it have one?" she breathed. "Yes, the owner's local," he replied, his gaze steady. Emily's stomach sank. Someone in Seattle had done this, and she'd uncover who. A chip means it wasn't a stray. Someone abandoned it, she thought, fists clenching as she stared at the dog. "I can't legally share personal details without notifying them first," Harris said carefully. "But the registered owner's from here." Emily stifled her anger. "Did anyone report it missing?" she asked. "No," he said curtly. "No reports, no posters. The owner didn't want it back." "What's its name?" she asked quietly. Harris's lips pressed thin, then he nodded. "Shadow." Emily's stomach churned. She knew that name, a respected gym owner in town. Yet he'd left this dog to die. Her fingers trembled as she looked at Shadow. How could someone do this? She swallowed the lump in her throat. "What happens now?" she asked, voice breaking. Harris crossed his arms. "Legally, we have to notify the owner before transferring care." Emily stiffened. "You're saying we have to call him?" He paused. "If we don't, and he shows up later, it could get messy. But based on what you found, I doubt he'll claim it." Emily exhaled, her head spinning. This wasn't just neglect, something darker. She glanced at Shadow, breathing slow, body weak. "I want to adopt it," she said firmly. Harris blinked, surprised. "It's in rough shape, might never fully recover." "I don't care," she cut in. He studied her for a long moment, then softened. "We'll see. Make the call. If the owner relinquishes, it's yours." Emily felt her pulse pound. She knew no one would come for it, and maybe that was for the best. Emily sat rigidly in the clinic's small office, fists clenched as Harris dialed the number. The room was quiet except for the faint beeping of the monitor beyond the door. Shadow was still fighting for life, and she was about to hear the voice of the man who tried to end it. Harris pressed the phone to his ear. One ring, two, then a gruff voice. "Yeah? Hello. This is Dr. James Harris from Pacific Paws Clinic. We have a dog registered to you," he began. "What dog?" the man interrupted. Emily's blood ran cold. "A Malamute found tied to a tree in freezing conditions, nearly dead. The chip traces to you," Harris continued calmly. Silence, then a harsh chuckle. "Oh, that mutt! I ditched it days ago." Emily's jaw clenched painfully. Ditched it? Harris repeated, his tone sharp. Yeah, useless. Weak. Do whatever with it, I don't care, the man said indifferently. Emily trembled with rage. Harris stayed professional. So you're waiving ownership? Don't care, it's not mine anymore, the man grumbled. Emily snatched the phone. You tied it to a tree and left it to die, she yelled, shaking with fury. He snorted. It's just a dog, lady. Her hands shook, but Harris gently took the phone back. We'll handle it, he said flatly and hung up. Emily stood there, heart hammering. Is it mine now? She asked hoarsely. Harris nodded with a knowing smile. It's yours. Just then, a soft whimper came from the treatment room. Emily bolted inside. Shadow lay in blankets, but his eyes were open, alive, looking at her. Her throat tightened. She reached out and touched his head. He didn't flinch. His tail gave a weak wag. Emily let out a shaky laugh through tears. You're safe now, buddy, she whispered, and this time, he believed her. Shadow was left to die but refused to give up. Now, after all he'd endured, he had a second chance at life. What do you think should happen next in Shadow's journey? Let us know in the comments, and if this story touched you, like, subscribe, and share to spread tales of resilience and hope.